And so those voices became your companions. And I thought, as this kid in this teeny tiny small town who's a sports fan, wow, how cool would it be to be at the Milwaukee Arena or Milwaukee County Stadium or Lambeau Field?
Today on the Sideline, I'm chatting with the television voice of the Memphis Grizzlies. Pete Pranica is up next. Welcome back to the Fifth Quarter Podcast. I'm your host, Sandy Adams, and this is where we dive deep into the world of sports, talking with retired athletes, current athletes, and everyone that makes the sports world great. A quick reminder, if you're not already subscribed to the podcast, make a note, subscribe to the show wherever you listen or watch. You can find out all the information and all the sites we're on at our website at 5thquarterpodcast.com. Now, grab your iced tea or your coffee. Get ready to be motivated and inspired, because this is where the real stories are told. Today on the Sideline, we're back in Memphis, where basketball reigns supreme. The NBA season is quickly approaching, and on today's show, we're taking you behind the scenes with anyone familiar with the Memphis Grizzlies. Yes, that is Pete Pranica, television voice of the Memphis Grizzlies. Pete, welcome to the show.
Sandy, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
I know this is kind of old hat for you because you're always on television, and we've known each other for probably 3 or 4 years, I think now,
Hmm.
kind of getting to know each other over the years. But I wanted to have you on because, as you know, NBA season is quickly approaching. I think, when does it start? October?
Training camp will be the first week of October, 5 preseason games starting on the 7th of October. And then the opener is in Salt Lake City on October 23rd.
So training camp, how long is training camp actually?
Uh, in terms of the number of practices, it's fairly short, and this year it'll be 3 days, I think, in Nashville, and then the team will come back. They'll have their open practice on Sunday, October the 6th, fly to Dallas that night, and then the night of Monday the 7th will be their first preseason game.
So this is something that just came to me. They expect, obviously, these guys are getting paid millions of dollars. So they expect when they show up at preseason camp that they're ready to go. Like
Oh
they
yeah,
don't need, they don't need to hopefully they've all been working out and getting back in shape and everything this summer,
yeah,
which is, yeah.
yeah, absolutely. They've been they call it open gym or pickup basketball or whatever you want to call it, and they have their various partners that they want to work out with. We've had a situation where players have requested a specific Grizzlies assistant coach to travel with them overseas. Santi Aldama went back to his home in the Canary Islands a couple of years ago with Zaire Williams and Darko Rajakovic, who was a coach with the Grizzlies at the time. So they set up their own program when they end the season. The coaching staff gives them a to-do list. These are the things that you need to work on during the summer, and the expectation is that they will have done their homework over the summer.
Not like kids in school and in college where they come back and they didn't read the summer book list or something like that. But that's actually pretty cool. I know when this airs, Jessica Benson will have already been on the show, and she was talking about how difficult it's been for her on her show to come up with content because there's no basketball right now. And she said, when John Morant dropped that video, like a couple of weeks ago, they were just like dissecting everything that the video, it was like 1 or 2 minutes long. And she was like, we're dissecting every little bit about the video. Um,
Sure, it's water in the desert of the
that's right.
summer.
That's right. That's right. So I wanted to kick off this conversation since we're already talking about the NBA. I wanted to kick this off with, so I've read, because I did some research, that you've been the voice of the Grizzlies since 2004. Is that correct?
That is
Okay.
correct.
Okay. You and Brevin Knight, correct? He's your co-host.
Hmm.
Okay. So you guys make what you do look so easy. And I love that when I read on Twitter, because I'm on Twitter a lot, and I call it Memphis Twitter, because you have the regular people on there, but everybody's watching the Grizzly version of the telecast, which is what you and Brevin do. And everybody's like complimenting you guys on how good of a job you do, which is different from the Tiger Twitter, which we complain a lot about the broadcast people for Tiger basketball. So, I watched I was following you on Twitter. I sound like I can't talk today. I was following you on Twitter for one of the games last season, and you had done one of those, work view
Hmm.
photographs and posted it on Twitter. And I was amazed. There was a list of like notes, and it was just really long. There were so many notes. So even after, 20 something years, how much preparation goes into each game for you?
It goes, I say, anywhere from 2 to 3 hours for every hour that we are on the air. So we can be on the air 2.5, 3 hours. So it can run anywhere from 6 to 9 hours at least to prepare for a game. And it doesn't matter how long you've been doing it, the league is always changing.
Right.
The identities of the different teams are changing from year to year. And so the preparation that I do, a lot of it is quantitative. There are so many data points right now. There is so much information out there to really define the way that a team plays. And one of the best pieces of advice I got when I started doing NBA on a full-time basis was from Steve Snapper Jones. He said, "Can you identify how a team wants to play? Are they a jump shooting team? Are they a pound the paint team? Are they a 3 point shooting team? Do they pick and roll a lot? Do they play big? Do they play small?" And once you understand the way a team wants to play or what their identity is, then you can explain that to the viewer. And then you always have a baseline. Okay, the
Mm.
Washington Wizards, they shoot 43s a game. I may not cite the exact number, but I know
Right.
basically that they shoot a lot of threes. Well, they shoot a lot of threes, but they're not very accurate with threes. And then that sets up your storyline for the entire game. Do they play to their identity? Or do they fall short of their identity? Do they exceed what they normally would do? And if they're on either side of normal, either exceeding or way below, why is that happening? Is it something the Grizzlies are doing? Is
Right.
Washington just having a bad night? And so a lot of what I do is statistical analysis. And so, in reference, to what you saw in that picture, I have what I call an annotated roster for both teams. Every player is included, their height, their weight, number of years in the league, when they were drafted, if they were drafted, where they went to college. Then there's another block with their basic statistics, points, rebounds, assists, steals, shooting percentages. And then I have, and this is a program that has been sold to a number of broadcasters called Broadcaster's Edge. And then for each player, I've got 6 lines of biographical information that I will type in. And I can change it from game to game, or if there's a bit of information that I didn't use because we only see Washington twice a year,
Right.
it stays in the program until the next time we play Washington. Then I go ahead and update it. And then the other thing that I do is I keep a set of note cards with storylines, trends, things that are of the moment, as it were. And
Right.
those are color coded. Grizzlies get blue cards. The other team gets whatever their primary color is. So you keep all this information together, and it does take a while to accumulate it, but you have a system, and by the time you get to the midpoint of the season, you're in a pretty good groove, and you don't
Right.
have to really um, take a long time over it. The fact of the matter is, Sandy, there's so many data points in athletics right now that you could go down a rabbit hole and
Right.
you could prepare for 20 hours for a game, but you only use maybe on a good night 10% of your material anyway. So it's a law of diminishing returns.
I think a lot of people out there that don't know any broadcasters don't really pay attention that much. They think you just sit there and talk about what's who's playing what, like, oh, they made that shot, great shot. But they don't really think about everything else that goes into that. And do you guys work off any script?
We really don't. I
Which
know
is
that
crazy, which is
which
crazy that
it astounds. Well, to the extent that we have a format, and the format really is the most important thing for the pregame show, because you're dealing with, well, we're going to talk about the Grizzlies, talk about the opponent, maybe talk about the league in general, coach interview, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a framework for the
right.
game broadcast itself. In our production meetings, we decide we're going to take a spotlight on one Grizzlies player, one opponent player, And then what we call our keys to the game, or the pinnacle effective advice of the
Sure.
game, because it is sponsored, give them their shine.
That's right.
Um, but Brevin and I it's amazing because we did not know each other at all before we started doing games
That's
together.
crazy. That is crazy.
I knew him as a player.
Right.
I remember a time where I think he had 3 steals against the Grizzlies when he played for the Clippers, so I didn't like him very much. Um, but we just it's crazy, Sandy. We just fell into being best friends,
Right.
and we play golf all the time. We talk and we text all the time, and he loves his Giants. I love my Packers, and so there's that little rivalry. But we do freak out the tech crews when we go on the road, and they say, "Well, when are you guys going to rehearse?" Like, we don't rehearse.
Right.
Brevin and I have been doing this for like 15 years, and we have never, ever rehearsed, because when we go on and we do our opens live, I want to hear what he's saying and really pay attention to it, not think ahead of what I want to say next,
Right.
but I want to follow on what he's saying. And so then it becomes really a conversation rather than a scripted, you say
Sure.
this, I say this, and becomes a tennis match.
And I think that really reflects, I think the audience really picks up on that because you guys get a lot of compliments. I see on that on Twitter. You guys get a lot of compliments about how well you work together and just how enjoyable the show is. And I think that speaks to your relationship with each other. So, how do you balance that excitement when you're in the middle of like a really fast paced game and things are going crazy? How do you handle that with the need to be clear and concise in your commentary?
You take a lot of deep breaths, honestly, because you can't get too caught up in it. Now, there are moments, obviously, that calls for your call to be elevated, for you to be
Sure.
louder, for you to really punch through. Um, the only way that you really get used to it is to do this a lot. And this is my 21st season with the Grizzlies, but it's my 32nd in the NBA. So I've been with a
Wow.
couple other
Yeah.
franchises, and so you learn uh, how to pace yourself,
Hmm.
because there could be a highlight play in the first quarter, and you don't want to just go crazy in the first quarter, and then what do you do for the next three? So it's also really, really important to stay in the moment,
Hmm.
and not let the moment get too big. I think that's probably the best way to explain it.
So, how do you keep yourself passionate about calling these games?
It's easy. I mean, we have an opportunity to sit courtside in most arenas anyway, and
Right.
watch the world's greatest athletes play an incredible game. And to be in a building with 16, 17,000, 18 screaming people, and to see all-star caliber players like John Moran, how can you not be excited
Exactly. Exactly.
about this? And the other thing too, Sandy, is live sports. It's the greatest reality show there is.
It's
It's not scripted. We have no idea what's going to happen. And that's really part of the joy of this, is going to an arena and you don't know what you're going to see. You
right.
may see a triple overtime game, you could see a blowout, or you could see another moment like Steven Adams a couple years ago, the long pass against San Antonio. Morant catches it in the air, contorts his
Yes.
body, and makes the shot. That
Yes.
play lives on forever.
Hmm.
And it just happened one night. Well, we're playing the San Antonio Spurs. I'm driving to the arena. Well, what's going to happen tonight? Well, that happens.
Right.
And so you just try to be, like I said, you try to be in the moment, but it's those moments and the promise that something amazing is going to happen. It keeps you energized and keeps you want to come back.
So, how did you? So, when you started, when did you start broadcasting NBA?
It would have been 1990.
Okay, that was before social media.
Right, right.
So you've seen the evolution of no social media to social media and really the digital age. How
Mhm.
has that made your life easier and how has it made it harder, or your job? How has it made it easier versus harder?
Digital media, in terms of social media, in some ways it's made our jobs a little easier because you can follow key broadcasters,
Mm.
sports writers from around the country. And it really helps with your research, that you don't have to go to 25 different newspaper websites to
Right.
try to get information. So that obviously has been a help. I mean, Twitter X has been through a lot. but it still remains a pretty good aggregator of sports
Mhm.
information, which is very, very helpful. Um, as far as what's challenge, I don't want to say difficult, but what's challenging about it is the responsibility that you have for every call that you make. And the reason is that our calls live forever. I just pulled up on the NBA X feed a couple of days ago, the top 100 dunks from last season. It turned out that number 100 was one of Jaws, and it's
Right.
our call. So you do realize that you have a responsibility when something amazing happens, that you really need to nail it. And so your calls do live on forever. And the other thing too about social media, you get feedback. One of the questions that I'm most frequently asked is the whole hammer nail coffin thing, to indicate when a game is safely in hand for the Grizzlies. It was something that I don't even remember how I made it up or how I came up with it.
Right.
But the reason that I kept it, Sandy, was because people on social media said, that's really cool. We like that.
Right.
And so sometimes, um, and even during the game, I'll check my Twitter feed, and somebody may say, "Hey, did you know that you mispronounced this guy's name?" Or they may ask a question about what really happened, and if I can answer during a timeout, I'll answer it.
Right.
So the interaction with fans is a positive by and large on Twitter X and other forms of social media.
You know, back to that, how people can stay informed. When I lived in Houston, that's how because I didn't get to watch a lot of the Tiger games, and I followed all the sports reporters, so I was able to, keep that contact. But I'll also tell a little secret is even now during basketball games, if I don't understand the call and we don't know what's going on, I pull up the Twitter account and I go look at the reporters that I know or whoever's calling in FedEx Forum, and because I get an answer quicker. So for me,
Exactly.
it's educational purposes. The other thing that I think became really famous that you did was the thing about the referees are
Hmm.
here and they'll be on time. Can you? Because I didn't understand. I was like, are they not on time? Like, isn't that a given? And I ask you that. So can you tell that little story? Because that's something that you've put on repeat too.
Right, right. When I worked for the Portland Trailblazers for 5 years, and the public address announcer would always say, the three officials as assigned by the NBA are, name the names.
Right.
And I thought, well, maybe that's the verbiage that the NBA wanted, and always want to curry favor with the NBA.
Right.
And so one night when Brevin and I were doing the game, and I said, we have three officials and they've been assigned by the NBA. And Brevin just totally blurted out, and they showed up on time. I kind of looked at him, and he just like shrugged his shoulders, and it became our thing.
It did.
And to this day, it's not a very alluring origin story, but that's it. And to this day, and I know so many of the referees so very well that they'll come out, and one referee will walk out and point to his wrist. Hey,
Oh,
we showed up on time.
that's
Um,
funny.
but I'm trying to think, in all the years that I've done this, I don't remember a referee being late. Although a couple of years ago, I did talk to a referee who they tried to get to the arena anywhere from 2 hours to 90 minutes prior to tip off, and he had some flight delay. He was a last
Right.
minute ad because the referee originally assigned had a kidney stone, and so this guy was trying to make a connection through Atlanta, which you know how difficult that can
Yes.
be.
Yes.
And he did barely make it on time, but he did make it on time. So I for people who are wondering, did a referee ever not show up on time? No, it's not been the case. It's just a joke. But Sandy, I'm going to tell you something, a sidebar to this story. We always thought, oh, this is just really a fun thing, ha ha ha, that we do. Years ago, there was a young woman who was blogging about the team. And she came up to me one day and she said, you know that thing that you do with the referee showing up on time? And I started to chuckle. And she said, I know that y'all look at it like it's funny. She said, my son is autistic and he is inconsolable until he hears you say, we have three officials and they showed up on time.
Oh,
And
wow.
then he's like, okay, I know it's time to watch basketball. And if ever there was a time where the impact of what we do and
Sure.
say came home to roost. That was it. And so, we keep on doing it. It's our thing and everybody seems to enjoy it. So we'll keep on.
Well, and it's such a simple, literal thing kind of that, but it's funny how everybody pays attention to it because it's not like you put it in bold letters anywhere. It's just in the middle. It's like a few words in the middle of your tweet. And everybody pays attention to that and just kind of notices. I think that it's a great way to also build community and
Hmm.
build those connections with the followers and stuff and kind of make people think, well, I'm on the inside joke. I've got it. I understand. How did you know? Let's go back to when you started out. How did you know, or was there a time when you knew that this was the path you were on?
Oh, when I was a little kid, and I grew up in a small town of literally 200 people, about 15 miles north of Green Bay, and your nearest neighbors, a mile down the road, and I have a sister. I don't have any brothers,
Mhm.
and big sports fan. Green Bay Packers, obviously, they were 15 miles away, and the Milwaukee Bucks, Milwaukee Brewers, 2 hours to the south, and those were the days. I grew up in the early 70s where games were not on TV all the time.
Right.
If the Milwaukee Bucks televised 20 games a year, that was it. And same for the Brewers. Now the Packers games were always on TV, but in those days, this is how old I am. Home games were blacked out. You couldn't watch them in the home market.
Right.
You had to
Right.
go to the game. So a lot of the sports that I consumed as a kid were on radio, and so those voices became your companions. And I thought, as this kid in this teeny tiny small town who's a sports fan, wow, how cool would it be to be at the Milwaukee Arena or Milwaukee County Stadium or Lambeau Field and to be there in the crowd and to call the games? And that just, it really, really fired my imagination. And there was something that, always wanted to do. Watch sporting events whenever I could, and I knew at 5'7", and in those days I was super skinny. There was no hope for me as an athlete. So if I wanted to stay close to athletics, this would be the way I'd have to do it.
Now, with basketball, I'm assuming though, even though you didn't play, you knew the game of basketball.
It was one probably that I spent the most time on, along
Mhm.
with football, and just the way my career path worked out, I ended up in the NBA. I mean, if I
Right.
had different friends or a different network, maybe it would have been in the NFL. Who knows? It's entirely just the way life unfolds.
So, when you send in your questionnaire, because yeah, I make them fill out a form, everybody. When you send in your questionnaire, you talked about, and I already knew this, you do play by play for a variety of sports, but here's some of them. When you said field hockey, fencing, judo, volleyball, soccer, weightlifting. How do you keep track of all the different rules for each sport?
There are a couple of ways of doing it. So I did fencing and judo and team handball for the
Oh,
Olympics,
you did
and
handball also.
I did handball also. Yeah, great, great sport. I wish it caught on here in the States. If you're doing stuff for the Olympics, so NBC has researchers, and they will assign a researcher to a particular sport. And when you are hired to call events for NBC, you will get material on the rules, the
Right.
international players, all the different international competitions. Because, like, handball has a European championship, a world championship in competitions other than the Olympics themselves, and the rules are part of that. Uh, you watch videotape. When I did team handball in 2004, my analyst actually had some tapes of handball matches, and the commentary was in German. So I didn't understand the commentary, but I understood the flow of the game. So that's how that's presented. For other sports, like I did field hockey a couple of years ago in Chapel Hill, and that was a crazy experience. I'd never done that before, but now everything's online. You can read about strategy and you can read
Right.
about the basic rules, and your analyst is someone who almost certainly has played the sport and knows the finer points of it. And so when you're doing a sport that you're not terribly familiar with, you don't try to, take a deep dive into the rules. That's what your analyst is for, because they've actually played the game. So it's research like anything else. And knowledge of the rules is very important for the credibility of any announcer. So you definitely have to study that.
Do you always work in tandem with an analyst?
Yeah, the
Okay.
only time that I would not have, I've done some Redbirds baseball and
Right.
baseball on radio. Typically, you can do solo, but everything else, there's always a broadcast partner, broadcast analyst.
Interesting. I didn't even know that. So let's talk about, you said you did two Olympics for NBC. Which Olympics?
2004 in Athens and 2008 in Beijing.
Wow.
In 2004, I was actually in Athens, which was pretty
That's
cool.
that's so cool for the
It
Olympics in Athens.
it was absolutely a mind blowing experience, particularly when you go up to the roof of the hotel and have a drink, and oh, there's the Acropolis over there.
Mhm.
It was pretty amazing, and to be around some real legends, to be around people, like Bob Costas and Dan Hicks and Rowdy Gaines, and here's Dick Ebersol, Mr.
Mhm.
Saturday Night Live and producer for the Olympics, uh, telling you how NBC wants you to cover these games. That was just an absolute mind blowing experience. 2008, the Beijing Olympics were entirely different. So in 2004, Dick Ebersol had decided we're covering every sport and we're taking every announcer for every sport to Athens. We took over a whole Marriott hotel in downtown Athens, and the International Olympic Committee said you're never doing that again. And so in 2008 and Olympics subsequent to that, track and field, basketball, probably gymnastics, and a few other commentary groups actually would go to the Olympics physically. The rest of us would stay back. In 2008, we were in New York City. Saturday Night Live goes dark in the summer. And in the summer of 2008, NBC built about a dozen soundproof, they almost look like little trailers
Right.
for a producer on one side of the glass and then the announcers on the other side of the glass. And we had monitors with the video from Beijing. And those trailers were placed on the stage of Saturday Night Live. Was,
Wow.
so I spent a month in New York doing weightlifting, because there was weightlifting pretty much every day as you go through the weight classes, the men, the
Right.
women. So we'd go in, we'd call a couple hours of weightlifting, and then I had the rest of the day to explore New York City. So it was a pretty fun month.
Um, what so that was pretty much the high and the low. The low being, well, I mean, you got to experience New York, but I mean, you didn't get to go to Beijing.
No, no, but I was so blessed in Athens, because as
Mm-hmm.
it turned out, the woman that was my handball analyst, her husband works for GE,
Right.
and because GE is with NBC and GE was providing a lot of things for the Olympics, here it is the day before our first handball telecast, and she says to me, "Hey, I've got extra tickets for the opening ceremony." So I got to see the opening ceremony for the Olympics in Athens, which was just an absolute crazy, crazy experience. And again, to have Dick Ebersol be our leader
Mhm.
and to tell us how the best way to talk about these athletes that nobody has ever heard of before, to make
Right.
them human, and to really illuminate their drama for our viewers. He's one of the most compelling speakers I've ever met.
As much as I was consumed by the Paris Olympics just last month, and as much as it was a great broadcast, and I got to say, hands off to NBC for hiring Snoop Dogg to come out, because I don't know why. I just love the shots of him, especially him and Martha Stewart. But I do miss the stories that Bob Costa would, and maybe it was his voice, but I missed some of those stories. As much as it was beautiful and exciting, I think the athletes made it more exciting. I do miss some of that storytelling that
Yeah,
they used to have.
that's a really good point. And I was listening to a podcast. I can't remember which one anymore. One of the sports media podcasts, and there was conversation about that. And I think it was Mike Tirico actually on the Smart List podcast, and he said research has shown that people don't have the attention span to listen to that story anymore.
Yeah.
And so the up close and personal pieces that were the invention of Rune Arledge back in the 1970s on ABC, those
Right.
pieces have gone away. So you have to be, if you're in a position like me, and we had this in Beijing, where there was a German weightlifter who got sideways with the German Weightlifting Federation. He changed somehow his residency to Austria. And in the midst of training for the 2008 Olympics, his wife was killed in a car crash.
Oh my God.
We end up, all he has to do is one lift for the gold. He hits this lift and he gets the gold medal. His last name was Steiner. I can't remember his first name. So we tell the story, but you have to do it, in bullet point form.
Right.
And it was, you talk about highlights at the Olympics, even though we weren't in Beijing, that was one of the highlights because we were able to get that story out. And in fact, subsequent to that, a columnist in the Seattle Post-Intelligencer wrote a column about how we handled it. And specifically quoted what we said about Steiner and all that he thought that he went through. So they've gone away from the longer form storytelling. So then it becomes really the province of the announcer to try to hit the bullet points to build up the drama, to tell the story, because nobody has any idea who this guy is.
Exactly. And there's so many of those people that go to the Olympics. They've been obscure. Nobody knows who they are for 3 or 4 years or longer. And then they're on the world's biggest stage. And we want to know who they are. But you're right about the attention span. So, looking at your career, I know I talked about, when did you know this was the path you wanted? But was there one specific job that you think just kind of cinched you into your current path?
Oh,
Or made you realize that I'm good at this and it's going to be okay?
yeah, I think, I
Yeah.
like that. Well, because just to give people the background, my high school had a radio station. So I've been doing games on radio or television since before I could drive. I mean, that's quite a while ago. But what ended up happening is I got hired to be a fill-in radio play-by-play announcer for the Detroit Pistons after they had won their second world championship. And to be able to do that, to have the approval of an elite NBA franchise, to work with people like Isaiah Thomas and John Sally, and Dennis Rodman was my first walk-off player interview, I'll have you know, to give you an idea of some of the twists and turns of my career. But to be around people like that and to be in the midst of that, and you would go ahead and you do the game. And I remember very vividly the very first NBA game that I had done on radio for the Detroit Pistons. It was an exhibition game. It was in all places, Sky Dome in Toronto. And the engineer, and I worked that game by myself, and the engineer was the engineer for the Boston Celtics. And I finished the game. It went down to the wire. It was a game-winning shot for Jeff Malone of the Utah Jazz over the Detroit Pistons. And I call it, and I sign off, and I put down my headset. And I don't think I'd ever been that exhausted after a game in my life. And the engineer turns to me and he says, "Hey, how was that?" And I said, "Well, that was my first NBA game." And his eyes got real wide and he said, "That was your first NBA game?" He says, "Holy cow." So you got that outside validation from somebody who's been around a lot that, hey, you could be really good at this.
Yeah, because I think we're always harder on ourselves and we pick apart everything we did wrong, but people on the outside actually have more perspective sometimes. I want to really quickly, the Dennis Rodman, you said he was your first walk-off player interview.
Right.
I want to just kind of give us a brief little thing.
What I forget what my first question was, but he did drop BS.
Yes.
Except he said the full word.
Right.
And I'm thinking like, okay, this is my first regular season game, and I don't know if I'm going to see a second regular season game. This was prima donna, pre-tattoos, pre-piercing, so he was still kind of the eager puppy dog type guy, and not the persona that we see now.
Right. I'm not sure if anybody out, because I watch some of the soccer games, the women's soccer games, but I'm not sure everybody realized that Trinity Rodman is his daughter.
Mm-hmm.
And, I don't know if anybody brought it up that she was his daughter. I don't think they have a relationship. I discovered her a couple of years ago and I've been kind of following her career. But shout out, to her for just, excelling in a sport, and doing it on a world stage like that. Let's talk about, you kind of talked about just then about, you know, making, being out in the public and just kind of, you know, putting it out there and not sure what people are going to say about it. But how do you handle, the criticism that's eventually going to come in some form or fashion? How do you handle that being a public figure in sports?
Honestly, being in Memphis, I hate to say this, but everybody seems to like us. So there isn't that much. Sometimes you may get criticism from somebody who's watching on League Pass who's not a fan of either team or they're a fan of the other team,
Right.
and the way I look at criticism is that, is it valid? Does it
Yes.
teach you anything?
Right.
And fan is short for fanatic. And somebody says, well, you guys stink. Okay, well, that's not terribly constructive. Now,
Exactly.
if somebody says you're repeating the same word over and over again, I may go back and look at the tape and like, yeah, I did kind of overuse that phrase. So,
Right.
if there's criticism, is there validity to it? Um, More often than not, it's just somebody saying, you're dumb, and leave it at that.
Yeah, Memphis is a tough town here, I tell you. Looking back over your career, what's been probably the best piece of advice that still resonates with you today?
I think the best piece of advice, I was a college student at Notre Dame and doing Notre Dame football and basketball and such. And Notre Dame, what's crazy, Sandy, is that Notre Dame does not have a broadcast program per se.
Really?
Yet they have 4 or 5 broadcasters in the NBA. Ted Robinson, who does swimming and diving and tennis for
Mm.
NBC, he's a Notre Dame guy. And Don Criqui and the late Phil Donahue, also a Notre Dame alum. And so I would try to reach out to as many of these people as I could. And in fact, it was George Blaha, the voice of the Pistons, who's a Notre Dame alum, who got me the gig with the Pistons in the first place. But I had written to Don Criqui, who, if people of a certain age might remember him from NBC and CBS, and he was one of the prime announcers for those networks, particularly on football. And I wrote to him and I said, send him a tape, please critique it. Any advice can you give me? And the one bit of advice that has stayed with me is what he wrote to me, which was, those who work hardest and want it most get there. And our business is so incredibly competitive that if you think you want to do it, you better really, really want to do it. And
Right.
you have to work very, very hard to set yourself apart. And that's what I tell any young person that comes to me and is looking for advice. And, piece of advice number one is find opportunities to get reps, because as I tell everybody, no one springs from the womb knowing how to do this.
Right.
This is a craft. This is something that you have to learn, something that you have to work at. And the only way you get better, like a golfer, you go to the practice tee and you hit ball after ball after ball. It's all about repetition, and the same for broadcasting. And then the second piece of advice is, you've got to want it and you've got to work exceptionally hard in order to make your way in this business, because it's getting more and more competitive by the minute.
Right. Um, if somebody like is in high school and they cannot get an opportunity to call a game or something like that, what is something they can do on their own to start getting experience?
Right now with our technological situation, your phone is a recording device. Put some
Right.
earbuds in, and if you're not calling a high school game, can you find a place somewhere in the stands where you're not going to bother anybody? And if you got rosters, call the game,
Right.
practice. When I was at Notre Dame, you didn't get a whole lot of reps because you might do every fourth or fifth Notre Dame basketball game, for example. And so before then, this was long before women's basketball is as popular as it is now. I asked the sports information director for the women's basketball team, hey, you mind if I sit courtside, bring a tape recorder, and just call the games for myself? And they said, go for it. And so, that's how I probably did more women's basketball games than I did in men's games. And
Right.
it was just me saying, I'm going to take time and I'm going to do this. So, get yourself a microphone and you can record it into your phone and play it back and critique yourself. and see if it's something that you're interested in doing and something that might work out for you.
And also see just how hard it is too, because a lot of times we think something is easy, and then when we start doing it, it's actually really more difficult or more trouble than they're willing to do. Let's talk about your podcast, because in your
Okay.
spare time,
What
you
there is of it.
that's right. You and another Memphian, Greg Graber, who I hope will be on my show soon as well. You guys started a podcast. I want to say it's almost a year old. I think it started last October. I
Could
think.
be. I
Okay.
we're about 35 episodes in. That's all I know.
Um, I know. I feel like y'all are breathing down my neck. But you guys started a podcast called Live a Little. Tell me a little bit about why you started it and what it is.
Okay. Greg had come to me a couple of years ago about doing a podcast, and I had been doing an NBA podcast, but it was only me, and I really didn't have the equipment to, bring in a second microphone or anything. And I didn't know if there, how frequently we wanted to do it. Was there a financial component to it? Really, how to
Right.
run. And I started looking on Amazon, and an audio board isn't all that expensive. The next couple microphones, that's not terribly expensive. And I was also doing a couple of podcasts for Memphis 901 FC, and
Mhm.
so I just needed a little bit more gear. And I said to Greg, Greg, I got the gear. I'm paying for a company to host this other podcast. Do you want to do this? And he jumped on it. And so we decided that he came up with the format of the show, which was basically what's going on in our lives, a recommendation for something that we have experienced or think other people should experience.
Right.
Uh, he does airing of we do. He came up with airing of the grievances,
You
where, where,
do.
where, where we try not to be two grumpy middle-aged men, and then we talk about what's on the horizon. And the gimmick that we came up with, and I can't even remember if it was his thought or mine, but if we record during the afternoon, we each have we're drinking a beer. So it's two middle-aged guys just talking about stuff,
Which
over a
I
beer.
love. Like, I love that part. I love that part.
And it just becomes a conversation.
Right.
Call it kvetching or whatever. And the other thing that Greg touches on is also mindful moment, because for those of your listeners who don't know, Greg has been teaching mindfulness around the country to corporations and to athletic teams, and he does so also at Lausanne Collegiate. So he'll bring an element of mindfulness to it. So, at one point we added the tagline, a podcast about everything and nothing, because he said basically this podcast is kind of a verbal version of Seinfeld.
That's
It's
what I
about
was just
everything and
thinking.
nothing.
That's right. That's what I was thinking.
That's where we came up with it, and we have fun with it, and hopefully people will listen to it, and even if they're not Arsenal supporters, we're both Arsenal supporters, the soccer team in the Premier League, but we really do take it seriously about books that we read and
Right.
recommendations, and try to make something other than just kvetching and complaining about the poor service that we got at the airlines.
So, so where can they listen to the podcast at?
We are everywhere podcasts can be had,
That's right.
whether it's iTunes, Spotify, wherever you podcast, we are there. I guarantee it. And if you follow me on X, he's at Greg Graber, I'm at Pete Pranica, and we
Right.
always post the links to our social media sites.
And I'll have all the links in the show notes when when this episode airs. Okay, so let's talk about. You've already talked about advice for people. I'm going over my notes. I'm not like I'm trying to get back in the swing and things. I took like a month off because my podcast I ended up being just me, and I was struggling to get an episode out each week. And so I just decided I'm going to take the whole month of August off and but go ahead and schedule recordings and then start airing them again in September. So I got to get back in the swing of things. So as we said, the start of the NBA season is coming up in just a few weeks. Looking back, what are your three most memorable games?
Three most memorable games.
Yes.
Uh,
Or is that even
yeah,
possible?
That is really really hard to come up with just three. However, because you gave me this nice run of show, and you see the red ink, I've actually you
I
know
think, I
thought
think
about this.
I think you're the only person who's ever made notes. In fact, some people are like, I ask them a question, they like get deer in the headlight look, and I'm like, I sent you the questions.
Right, right. Which I appreciate, by the way. I mean, you can go back to a number of things. It could be the first NBA game that I ever did, or whatever. The three that I came up with,
Right.
and we could go probably 10. Um, Number one would be beating San Antonio in game one when the Grizzlies were an eighth seed. Shane Battier hits a three that essentially decides the game, and his wife is about to give birth in Houston. The legend is that Shane did his post game interview, threw his warm up back on, didn't take a shower, and drove straight to Houston for the birth of his first child. So that, and then of course the Grizzlies go on and win the series, which is super memorable. I think one of my all time favorite calls, the Grizzlies are playing at home against LeBron James and the Miami Heat, and Rudy Gay hits a game winner from the baseline
Right.
over LeBron James. I think that's one of my all time favorite calls. And I go back and I look at that and the way that we called it, and then got out of the way. And our director, Tom Hewitt, did a marvelous job of cutting together a bunch of great camera angles that we didn't say anything, and we let the visuals
Right.
carry the story. And then the other one, there have been so many great jaw dunks
Yes.
and great plays. And I talked about the pass from Steven Adams. But as far as a game, it was John Morant dunking over Aaron Baines in Phoenix. Essentially, that was a game winning basket as well. And we got on the bus after the game, and that visual with our call on it had something like 1 million views already on social media.
Right.
It was that type of thing. So I think those are three, but you could stretch this list out to 10, and
Sure.
I think of other great moments, but those were the three that leapt to mind when I sat down and made my notes.
Okay. When is the first game you'll be calling for the new season?
Preseason, we're not really sure which preseason games we're going to do. We know that we'll do the two at home, and we'll probably do a third one on the road.
Right.
And then October 23rd at Utah Jazz, that will be our first regular season game.
Okay. And what are you most excited about? I think I already know the answer to this. Most excited about in the new season with the Grizzlies?
I'm most excited to see everybody healthy because they weren't last year.
I know, right?
That it was just a crazy year. So I'm looking forward to a full season of John Morant and Jaren Jackson
Yes.
Jr. and Desmond Bain together. I think
Yes.
that's the most exciting thing for me.
Okay. So tell us again, where can everyone find you on social media?
You can find me on X at Pete Pranica, same handle for Instagram, and yeah, that's where you can find me. It's a pretty easy handle, and those are the two predominant sites for me would be Instagram and X.
Are you more active on X than on Instagram?
Uh, I mean, in terms of reading X, I don't post a whole lot, and I
Right.
don't post a whole lot on Instagram either. I'm just kind of reading to see what's going on in the world.
I do think I probably post more on Instagram. Actually, I probably post more on LinkedIn, but Twitter, X, whatever anybody wants to call it, um, it has some funny things on there. I like catching up with everybody. There's some people that I kind of met when I lived in Houston, and I still like reading, especially like during game days, especially like the Grizzlies. And that's the other thing I love about Twitter is that when there's a game, any type of game going on in Memphis, it just feels like everybody is really close together because you get on Twitter/X and everybody's talking about the same thing. Although for me, I ended up reading the responses backwards. So I don't know. I don't, or I'm like, what is everybody watching right now? But I do love that community. Pete, thank you so much for being on the show today. I appreciate it.
Sandy, thank you so much for having me. It's been a delight.
Okay, thank you all for listening, especially if you've made it all the way to this part of the show. I appreciate all your support. Another reminder to subscribe to the show wherever you listen or watch. My mantra is like, share, and review. Follow us all on social media at 5TH Quarter Podcast. Until next time, remember, change is our ally and it paves the way for greatness. Stay inspired. Have a great rest of the week.